Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Great America Show. It's great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Wednesday in America. Foreign policy for the Biden administration has got this country into so much trouble. You can look at the border with Mexico that's out of control, drugs pouring through it, migrants pouring through it. You can look at the war that's going on between Russia and Ukraine. You can look at the war that's happening over in Israel with Gaza. They just seem to keep building up. The U.S. announcing they're going to send another $20 billion to Ukraine as a loan just before Joe Biden decides he's going to leave office on January 20th in just over a month. We're all counting down the days for that to happen. Drones flying over the Northeast for the last month or so. Government has no idea what's going on. John Kirby tells us those are just your regular drones you can go out and buy in the convenience store. Skies have been a little bit darker lately. That's why you're seeing more drones than you usually see. Folks, this government thinks we're stupid. They're the ones who are stupid. We're not falling for it anymore. We're demanding answers. The American people deserve answers as to why there's drones flying over our houses, in our neighborhoods, in close proximity to airports, to airplanes that we're getting on as passengers. We deserve answers. We're going to take all this up today with our guest. It's Colonel Doug Macgregor. He's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. He's a great American. And I want to get some insight as to what he believes is going on. Is this a government operation? Is this just commercial flyers flying their drones at 10,000 feet above airports? He's our guest today, Colonel Doug Macgregor. Colonel Macgregor, it's great to have you here on the Great America Show. I really appreciate you joining us. I want to start with first what's on everybody's mind, at least here in the Northeast, where I am in New York, people in New Jersey, about these drones. I want to roll a quick clip of John Kirby on with Bill Hemmer and his take on these drones. Now, it makes me nervous watching this. I think it's probably going to make you nervous watching it in the audience. Take a listen.
You hear all of these officials. You've heard a lot of concern, a lot of coverage. Where are you tonight on this?
As we look at the information we've got, Brett, and we've now examined some 5,000 different sightings, we've added detection capabilities, additional observers. As you and I stand here today, to date, our assessment is that this is lawful, legal, commercial, hobbyist, and even law enforcement aircraft activity. Some of it's manned, some of it's unmanned. We absolutely acknowledge that a lot of these are probably drones, but they're flying legally, and it is legal to fly drones in non-restricted airspace as long as you're registered with the FAA. And there's thousands and thousands of these kinds of flights every single day. I think there's more than 1 million drones that are registered with the FAA just in the United States alone.
Now, Colonel, before I get your take on that, I just have to admit I'm a little bit more in tune with this because I'm a commercial pilot. I'm not a journalist by trade, so I do understand the whole airspace issue. I'm going to pull this up for the audience to see here. If you look up in the map, Colonel, on the north and northwest, and you probably understand what we're looking at here. We're looking at New York airspace. You'll see a red circle on the top left-hand side. That's called a temporary flight restriction, a TFR. It means you can't fly over it at a certain altitude. The one to the south of that is another TFR. Looks to be over another Air Force base. But the northern one is Picatinny Arsenal, Colonel, a Air Force, a military base out in northern Jersey. And the TFR was issued, if you see on the screen here, on November 25th, and it's valid until December 26th. And they say it's for special security reasons. So this has been put out there now from the government for us to see, but we have John Kirby out here telling us these are just drones you buy at the convenience store, Colonel.
Well, I think John Kirby has a habit of adding to the confusion. And it's hard to explain why we're seeing these kinds of things, not just in the area that you showed me, but on the West Coast as well, other locations in the United States. And, I do not have personal knowledge of what this is, but I get lots of information sent to me by people that work with us at Our Country, Our Choice. And they tell me that, some of this is connected to some search that's underway for something radioactive. And I asked, well, what are you talking about? A lost warhead from the armed forces? And they said, well, it could be that. It could be something else. Then, of course, you always have someone who is convinced this is evidence for first contact. I don't think so, because First Contact would probably use far more sophisticated technology if they could fly that far to get here. I don't think that's it. And then finally, that somehow or another, all the hobbyists all across the country decided we're going to fly around these places and confuse everyone for the next few days. I think that's a little unlikely. So let's assume maybe you have the Department of Defense doing something and they don't wish to comment in depth on it. That seems plausible. I'm surprised Picatinny Arsenal has suddenly become so important. Over the last several decades, you've had lots of efforts to shut it down. So it's interesting. And I've been to Picatinny Arsenal, and I know a lot of the people there are very nice people. So let's just say DOD has a hand in this.
The thing that and to your point about people flying more drones, the White House says people might be seeing more drones since it's darker and the skies are clear and they're not used to drones. Colonel, I flew into Newark Airport last night from Florida, and I flew out to go to Florida on Friday. When I flew out on Friday, I see these things up at 5,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 7,000 feet. The airspace over Newark, you can't overfly Newark until 7,000 feet. Okay. So if you're it's a federal offense. If you fly any sort of drone, it doesn't matter if it's a drone this big or if it's a drone the size of a car, it's a federal offense. They take airspace very seriously in the FAA. If I fly through that airspace in my little Cessna, they have F-8, and the president's in town, they'll have F-18s coming up next to me. And if I don't abide by it, they'll shoot me down. Yet we have Kirby sitting here telling Bill Hemmer on Fox News, we shouldn't be shooting everything down just because we see it. I want to roll that clip for you and get your reaction.
Military bases have seen these drones fly over them. That's a federal offense. If there ever were justification to shoot a drone down, that would be it. Why hasn't it happened?
Well, because, look, first of all, Bill, the military commanders at installations have the authorities they need to defend themselves, their people, their interests, and certainly to protect our secrets and our national security. Sometimes the answer is to find a way to down a drone, and sometimes the answer is not. And a lot of it depends on the capability that the base commander has available to him or to her, but they have the authorities that they need. The sense that you have to shoot everything down just when you see it, even if you do believe that there's a malicious intent, doesn't comport with actual reality. So, I mean, it really depends on the situation at hand. But rest assured, commanders have the authorities that they need to take the action that they must to protect their facilities.
What did you military bases?
This is the same administration who's dumping billions of dollars into Ukraine to shoot missiles into Russia, providing them with U.S. military arms. This is the same administration who waited till a spy balloon flew over the whole entire continental United States and then used a $400,000 Sidewinder to shoot it down over the coast, off the coast of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Yet he wants to tell us with a straight face that we shouldn't be shooting anything down. And there's ways to get the drones down. It's just going to take over a month or so.
Well, I've heard this before. You know, I did not have sex with that woman. I think he must have understudied the Clinton spokesman. Look, he's having great difficulty twisting and turning to get the lie across. If this were not DOD related, obviously those things would have been shot down. I think that's perfectly clear. You made that point. I think you're right. The only thing we can conclude, it's DOD. The problem is that things that 50 years ago we would never have known about, we now know about. That's all. And I think we should leave it at that point now. Are they searching for something? I mean, one person said it was very clear. There's a threat to us. There's a dirty bomb out there waiting to explode. Who knows? I find that hard to believe, but that's more plausible than Brother Kirby's statements. I mean, this man is ridiculous.
Before we move on from that, because you bring up a good point, because I read the same thing about the radioactive material and the thing going missing, the container going missing. But I also saw an update on it that apparently the radioactive material that had gone missing was for like a PET scanner or something like that, or a CAT scanner that was going to be used in that. Why is it constantly, Colonel, that we're being like trolled by our U.S. government in this massive game of deception? It's almost like we're living in China, where you can't get a straight answer whether the sky's blue or the sky is gloomy one day or it's raining or it's not. We cannot get a straight answer out of this administration on literally anything.
I think you're right. And I think distraction is the word. All of these things are useful distractions. I mean, right now we have a massive military buildup of Turkish troops on the border with the so-called Syrian state inside Syria,
Right.
which is Kurdish. And, this is something that's been developing for a long period of time. How nice to have a distraction over the skies of New York, Washington, or anywhere else to divert people's attention away from serious things overseas. Too many lies for too long have destroyed the credibility of the United States government, and specifically both the State Department and the Department of Defense.
You're absolutely right. And I do want to get into the Kurdish forces. I do want to get into Syria. Before we get to that, I want to get your take on this administration that President Trump, and it can't come soon enough. It's about a month and 2 days before he's sworn in as 47. I want to get your take on particularly a man like Pete Hegseth. The man is going to be running an organization that you know far too well in the military. We'll start with Pete Hegseth. What's your thoughts on Pete? Does he make it through? Are you confident in the job he's going to do once I think he does get through?
Pete Hegseth's nomination came as a stark surprise to me, as it did to many other people. I certainly would not have selected someone like that with his background. It certainly does nothing to prepare him to deal with this large behemoth called the Department of Defense. I'm sure that'll come up in the confirmation hearings if he's sent to confirmation. He might be appointed in a recess appointment, in which case he could stay there for a year and then have to return for confirmation. If you look at all of the people that are being nominated right now, they are all, in my judgment, AIPAC approved.
Interesting.
That's what's most important. And it got to go back to the Republican convention. And there was a portion of the Republican convention when suddenly the Israeli flag, this enormous Israeli flag, was placed on the wall. And above it was the statement, Israel first. And this gentleman came out and tried to lead cheers for Israel first and got a sort of tepid response. But I think that's at the heart of most of these nominations. These are people that are committed unconditionally to whatever the Israeli state wants to do. And I think that's not an accident.
Very interesting. Before we move on, people like Hegseth and some of these other folks, a lot of them, never working in the field before, but we constantly have people, Colonel, that we bring in to run organizations under this administration, under the Bush administration, under the first Trump administration, who have been in these bureaucracies their entire career, have run the Pentagon their entire career, have been in the military their entire career, and they've got us into this massive mess. You look at the Pentagon, they've just failed their 7th or 8th straight audit, can't account for billions of dollars of funds. You look at the military-industrial complex blowing up like it's never blown up before. You look at a border that's wide open, and it's being run by people who have been in these organizations forever. Mayorkas and, I was going to say Buttigieg. I'm not sure where he came from. But nonetheless, you have these folks who are career bureaucrats who constantly get us in the shit. Do you think it's a breath of fresh air now that Trump is pulling some of these folks who are not career bureaucrats?
Not really. I think the problem is as follows. There are lots of people that you can find who could be qualified to do many of these jobs. Most of them are drawn from the swamp. That's certainly what Donald Trump did during his first administration. Right. And if you want to return to the revolving door, that guarantees no change. Remember, everyone on the Hill is preoccupied with one thing: change nothing, because change disrupts the money flow.
Right.
No one on the Hill wants to change the direction in which money is flowing, since they benefit from it.
Right.
Lou Dobbs, bless his soul, used to say, we have the best government in Washington that money can buy.
Yes,
and I'm afraid that's true. We still do. We're having that again with this particular group. I'm not saying it's easy to find people who place the interests of the country before their own interests. That's a difficult thing. But nevertheless, we could do a much better job than I think Donald Trump has done to this point. Now, we'll see. Donald Trump's problem in the past was that he took the position that it didn't really matter who was appointed because he was the decision maker. And he seemed to think that since the buck ended with him on his desk, that he could control everything. I hope he learned from the first 4 years that that's not the truth at all.
Yeah.
And if you're picking people on the basis of their willingness to do certain things, then they may not do anything else. In other words, you've got to be very careful of what your agenda is. And these are tough times. We're at a point in our history where we really need a massive overhaul, not just in the Department of Defense, but across the government. I mean, it's sort of interesting. You see Christie known as the governor who's appointed to take over the Department of Homeland Security. Well, that's one of the first bureaucracies I'd get rid of. Why do we have it? It's been an abysmal failure.
Right.
It's another bureaucratic exercise in bureaucratic constipation.
Right.
Get rid of it. We don't need it. What about agriculture? What about energy?
Department of Education.
We could do things differently with energy. Well, first of all, I don't think we need a Department of Energy.
Right.
You could turn the whole nuclear program for all of our nuclear power stations and everything else over to the Navy, because the United States Navy has the largest number of trained, competent nuclear engineers in the world.
Yeah.
That's what we have, is a nuclear submarine fleet. They know what they're doing, especially when it comes to weapons. There are a lot of things that we can do, and I think this Doge is problematic because the people that are at top of that, they don't know anything. I'm sorry. They don't know anything about Washington. They don't know anything about these agencies. And they don't understand what you're dealing with. So I think President Trump, as always, has good instincts and good intentions. I don't dispute that, and I like the man very much. But those are not going to count for very much in Washington if you don't know how the place works, right. If you don't know what the snakes and alligators in the swamp are doing.
Right.
That's the problem.
The issue is, I understand, I agree with everything you're saying. The issue is Donald Trump has been screwed over so many times before by people in his own orbit that it's brought him to this point now where he has no choice. You look at what John Kelly and Mad Dog Mattis, you look at the slew of people he had the first time, and it seemed everyone was there to sort of undermine everything he did and go against everything he did. We look at what Mark Milley did as Trump was getting ready to leave. And now we hear Joe Biden may be issuing him some sort of preemptive pardon because he did something wrong. Colonel, I want to take a quick break here. When we return, you had mentioned the money that's being dumped everywhere. $20 billion more going to Ukraine before Joe Biden leaves, but it's only a loan. We're going to get it back. We're talking with Colonel Doug Macgregor. He's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. We're coming right back. Stay with us.
I'm excited to announce our Christmas extravaganza is finally here. Get this season's flannel sheets for as low as $59.98. They won't last long, so get them while you can. Our famous My Slippers, they haven't been on sale for over a year. Regularly $119.98, now only $59.98. Our 6-piece towel sets are back in stock with extremely limited quantities, only $29.98. With hundreds of MyPillow products, there's something for everyone on your Christmas list. Bathrobes, duvets, quilts, down comforters, and so much more. So go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to save on all MyPillow products. For example, flannel sheets for as low as $59.98, or our 6-piece towel sets, just $29.98. But that's not all. I'm extending our 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st of 2025. Plus, all orders over $75 or more ship absolutely free.
We're back. We're talking with Colonel Doug Macgregor. He's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Colonel, before we went to break, I mentioned the $20 billion loan that Zelensky's getting before Joe Biden leaves. It's part of a $50 billion G7 support package. You do the math now. G7, they're giving 30. We're giving 20. Doesn't really add up here. I'm not sure if it's a gift from Joe Biden for some sort of business his son will be running once he gets back. But, I mean, how are we still going in this Ukraine war after all of this time? I say it all the time on the show, and I know you agree. There's no way Ukraine wins this war. What are we doing?
I think it's appropriate to think of Biden and his administration as a collection of arsonists. They've set fires in Ukraine. They've set fires in the Middle East, and they're uncontrolled, burning out of control, destroying everything. And so they've decided on their way out, since they can't stay in power, to throw as much gasoline as possible on them to sabotage whatever comes after them. Whatever comes after them is President Donald Trump. Now, it depends on how Trump handles these things, but we have to assume that 50% of everything you send to Ukraine is essentially lost in corruption.
Right.
It's just stolen.
Right.
I mean, look, if you've got President Zelensky's wife driving a Bugatti up and down the highway between Poland and Ukraine.
Right.
There's something wrong with that picture.
Right.
I'm not saying the Bugatti isn't a good thing. I remember a professional basketball player was brought up on charges on something and ordered to pay a fine. He turned around to his attorney. He said, "Great job. That's just one Bugatti payment." All right. So maybe we're dealing with something like that. But, bottom line is it's disastrous. We're just making matters worse. This is not in our interest as a state, as a nation. It's not in the interest of anyone. It's least of all the American people. Nobody voted for this stuff.
Right.
Remember? Nobody.
Right.
And in the meantime, what do we got open on the border? No border.
Right.
Millions poured in. We don't know where they are. And that's the existential question for us. What are we going to do about the border? What are we going to do to stop the deaths of over 120,000 Americans a year from fentanyl? Well, you're not going to stop it by getting on television and preaching, "Don't take fentanyl."
Right.
You're going to have to stop the fentanyl from coming in.
Right.
Nobody's made any damn effort to do that. I know some good people in the police and Border Patrol have tried, but they're overwhelmed.
Yeah. And
these are the things that Americans voted for. They didn't vote for widespread war, eternal war in Ukraine. The Europeans, all these governments in Europe are going to change.
Yep.
It started in Germany. It's going to hit France and Great Britain, everywhere. And you know what? Eventually, they're all going to say, "We're out."
Yep. You look what's happening in Canada right now, Colonel. They have had enough. I mean, Trump has this amazing effect that he's able to have on people. And if they're bad people, he manages to have everyone hate them. Trudeau was already hated to begin with, but you see what's happening in his parliament right now, and they want him out of there. Going back to Ukraine, the endless money, it seems Trump's not fully on board with Ukraine entering NATO. It's unclear if we'll even be in NATO in the next 4 years. But looking at it, and you know what, we're probably going to get put up on some webpage somewhere, maybe Mediaite, that we're Russian simps, but I'm not. I have no affiliation with Russia or anything like that. But if you look at it from Russia's standpoint, how do you think they look at it when you tell them NATO is going to be on their border? How do you explain that to them when they're a single country watching there and they have an organization of NATO on their border with missiles on their border? How do you explain that if you're NATO to Russia?
Well, I think the analogy is very simple, that Mexico and Cuba are both going to join the greater Russian-Chinese alliance.
Right.
And as a result, large numbers of Chinese and Russian troops, technicians, and military experts, along with armaments, are pouring into Mexico and into Cuba. And there's a large buildup of force in Mexico, and everybody's trying to figure out what it's for, and they finally realize it's designed to invade us and destroy us. Gosh, what would we do? I think we would have long ago launched B-52s and carpet bombed everything in sight, because that's our normal response. The Russians waited for years to do anything, and they saw this cancer metastasizing over decades.
Right.
They looked for someone with sense and honesty to say, "Wait a minute, we have interest in what happens in Cuba and places like Mexico. Doesn't Russia have a legitimate security interest in Ukraine? Not to annex it, not to govern it, but to simply ensure that it doesn't become a platform for attack against Russia." Well, too late.
Right. And nobody wants to see it that way. Nobody wants to look at it from Russia's standpoint. I'm not old enough to remember, but I've read a fair amount of history about 1 October 1962 and the 13-day period of something called the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Sure.
It's not just, you had mentioned Russia with respect to Mexico and Cuba. I invite everyone to go look at what they're doing in Honduras right now. How much money China has invested in Honduras, building electrical power plants, electrical dams in Honduras. Go look at a map and you'll find out where Honduras is relative to the United States. And you're soon going to realize it's not just caravans that are going to be coming through that southern border. It's going to be far worse than that. I just don't know. How does this end, Colonel? How does this end with Russia and Ukraine?
It ends with the destruction of the Ukrainian nation, which is well underway. How many millions have left is anybody's guess. What's the true population of a state that once had almost 40 million is now down to 17 or 18 million? Hundreds of thousands of dead, at least 600,000 dead on the battlefield, probably more. And most of your casualties in any war are taken at the end. It's hard for us to imagine, but for every German soldier killed on the Eastern Front, roughly 6 Soviet soldiers died. Now, when did the numbers begin to favor the Soviets? At the end, when the remaining German forces were compelled to retreat. The same thing was true for the Japanese. The Ukrainians are dying in great numbers every day, pointlessly. Why perpetuate this? Well, I think it's not going to work. I think ultimately Russia will decide the outcome. And This recent assassination of a Russian general, probably by Ukrainian elements inside Russia. And remember, Ukrainians can speak Russian as well as Russians, and are very difficult to identify. Russia is a huge country, one of the largest in the world, if not the largest. Borders are open and porous, so you can get in and out. It's not well guarded. The problem is, how do you guard thousands of miles? It just doesn't work. So I think the bottom line is that Russia will eventually crush what remains east of the river. I think they'll probably go into Kiev and root out this government. And at some point, the Europeans are going to say, that's it. This is enough, because that means that the Russians will continue west until they're on the Polish border. Not because they want to, they don't. That's the big lie. I mean, if we've learned anything, anybody's learned anything from the last century and the century that preceded it, occupying places is a disaster.
And it's expensive.
You want them to rule themselves. You just don't want your neighbor to be a blood enemy of the country that you live in. That's all.
Right.
And this is easily solved. Make Ukraine look like Austria. Austria became neutral in 1955. Eisenhower loved it. He said, let's find out whether or not we can make Poland and the rest of these places neutral, because he said we can't possibly defend them all.
Right.
Well, he was right. We have no interest in war in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And the Europeans that have been governing are maniacs. They've signed on for this ludicrous nonsense, the rules-based order, which is just an order that represents whatever we want. We call it the rule. America wants, the rule's this. A lot of Americans think, oh, that's great, we're powerful, but Washington has made itself universally hated. And we need to get out of this business. And that's what Donald Trump, I think, wants to do. Whether or not he can, I don't know.
Let me ask you because you mentioned a lot of good stuff in there. And fighting wars over there, like you said, nobody voted for. And we're going to get to the war that we have here at home, and that's the border with the cartels. Before we get to that, I want to just wrap up on the Russia-Ukraine issue with, if there is a concession to be made on Zelensky's behalf, and I think you're right. I've said since I've taken over this show for the great Lou Dobbs in August, I think we're going to see Zelensky one day get on an airplane with a bag of cash, with a few duffel bags, and never be seen again. In some country, we'll find him later on, his wife and all of them. But I think that's how it ends, and Russia ultimately does take over. In a perfect world, Colonel, with Donald Trump as chief negotiator, what does a concession look like for Ukraine with regard to Russia?
What President Trump should do is immediately suspend all military aid to Ukraine on the day that he is inaugurated. Number one. The only thing that keeps Ukraine alive is whatever support we provide, particularly in terms of cash. With the cash, you can pay off the crooks at the top of the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian bureaucracy, the Ukrainian government. Cut off the cash, the whole thing falls apart. Secondly, he should withdraw all U.S. personnel from Ukraine, both military or intelligence, in and out of uniform, doesn't matter. Everybody leaves.
Right.
Now, once these two things happen, I think the Europeans can convene a conference. We don't need to do it. Frankly, do you really care how much of eastern Ukraine remains Russian?
No.
I don't care. I have no interest in that whatsoever. I don't want to see any of my sons shipped overseas to fight for eastern Ukraine. Yep. Sorry, it's not important. So it's a European matter at that point. Then it's up to the Germans, the Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Romanians. And what we need to tell them is, we're out. This is your problem. Remember when President Trump was in at the beginning, and the first time, he took the position that, look at Europe, look at Japan. These people are very wealthy. They've got all the material wealth they need. Yep. Why can't they defend themselves?
Right.
And what he really wanted was not so much an end to NATO at that stage, but he wanted them to be their own first responders. Well, come on, let's get out of this, folks. Russia does not want to march west. Russia has no aspirations to conquer anything. Russia wants to do business, which is what we should be interested in. Get out of this business of criticizing everybody else's government. Ours is certainly not perfect. I don't see anybody else's government as perfect, but we all live on the planet, so let's do business.
Yeah,
I think Trump is inclined in that direction if he's allowed to do it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We're going to take up on the other side of this quick break. Before we go to break, I want to touch on one more thing, but we're going to take up our border here at home. We're also going to take up a new piece that you have with regard to Israel and Iran and another war that we're somehow in the middle of over there. Before we go to break, though, Assad being forced out of Syria, it poses a little bit of an issue for Russia that I want to take up with you. And it's Russians losing the Syrian port of Tartus, and it's their only place that they're able to refuel their subs. Now, Ukrainian intelligence, so we'll take this with a grain of salt, says just before 2 weeks ago when Syria had this whole regime change, those 5 ships were heading back to Russia, signaling that they may be pulling out of there completely. What can you tell us about Russia's role in Syria? And, I mean, will they still have some sort of presence there as it regards to them pulling out of the space?
We have roughly 840 bases beyond the borders of our country, all over the world. Russia had 1 in Syria.
Right.
It was never seen as a vital strategic interest to Russia. There were lots of people in Russia that said, sure, we want to help Assad, but why do we want our troops on foreign soil?
Right.
So I think departing Syria may be a disappointment in some ways, but I don't think it's viewed the same way we think it is here. This is not an embarrassment. They knew that Assad's government was on shaky ground.
Right.
We've been trying to overthrow it since 2011. We've destroyed its income. We've carved up the place into various entities. So I think they probably said, we've done all we can do. We're going to cut our losses and go. It's something I wish we would do right now in Ukraine. Russia is focused on what the threats are to its country along its borders. It's not focused on faraway places. It wants to be in good stead with all of the Muslim Arabs. They have 20 million Muslims inside Russia. Those Muslims, out of 140 million Russian citizens, have been assimilated. Those are happy people. There will be no Muslim uprising inside Russia's borders. But the point is they want to get along for business purposes. That's what the Chinese want. You mentioned, I guess you mentioned something about the Chinese building something in Honduras. Well, the Chinese are trying to make inroads all over the world,
Of course.
but they're not sending military power. We've become too militarized.
Right.
We've got to get out of this business of militarizing our foreign policy.
Right. Because you know what? I mean, we're in it for one simple reason, and I know you agree with me on this. It's padding the pockets of these military-industrial complex folks, the Lindsey Grahams of the Senate, these folks who are all for wars overseas. Now, I don't understand something, and maybe you could explain it to me in layman's, because it seems very simple to me, yet so difficult. We watch what happens when we destroy regimes as America. We watch what happened in Iraq. We watched what happened in Afghanistan. We created ISIS. The CIA created ISIS. We created the Taliban. We allowed them to do these things. Now we have Syria, another regime change, which presumably will see something else pop up with these folks being able to do whatever they want, free reign. When will America learn their lesson, Colonel, that we cannot be the world's police? And by us overthrowing governments, which is not our job, we're creating more destruction than we would have had in the first place with these people just running their own countries however they want to run it, as long as it's not bothering us.
The bottom line is, as I wrote in American Conservative, is that we're replacing this phony rules-based international order, which just is whatever we want, with chaos. It's back to our original discussion. If we can't have it our way, then we'll just become bomb throwers,
right.
Arsonists. Throw the gasoline on the fire and let it burn itself to the ground. That's not making us very popular around the world. And Syria is a perfect example. It's gone. It doesn't exist. It's disintegrated. It's not just a question of blocking resupply from Iran to Hezbollah. And by the way, If history teaches us anything, they'll find another way to resupply them. But the bottom line is that for the moment, Syria has disintegrated. It doesn't exist. It's going to be carved up. And we see a partition of Syria along territorial lines between Israel and Turkey, both of whom aspire to be hegemonic powers in the region.
Right.
Now, the Turks have almost 90 million people. The Israelis only have 6.5 million Jews. I don't know how many are left in Israel right now, since many of them left during the war.
Right.
That's pretty tough to exercise hegemony with that small number. That means that hegemony depends on us.
Huh.
And do we have an interest in that?
I think we've got a lot of interests that we shouldn't necessarily have. Colonel, I want to take one more quick break here. When we return, I want to take up that American Thinker article, and I also want to take up the war that we had spoken about, the war here at home, and that's our southern border. It's a real war. It's one that's affecting everybody we know. You probably know many people who have been affected by drugs, whether it's families or them directly. I know plenty of them, and it's ruining our country. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have allowed it to happen. No inroads. We're coming right back with Colonel Macgregor. He's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Folks, stay with us.
Because of your overwhelming support, our $14.88 MyPillow has been one of the biggest sales in MyPillow history. I couldn't think of a better way to say thank you than to extend our wholesale pricing through Christmas. Get a classic standard MyPillow for only $14.88. Upgrade to a queen size, just $18.88. King size, only $1 more. Get my body pillows for only $29.88. And ready? Multi-use MyPillows, only $9.88. It's perfect time to stock up for Christmas gifts for everyone on your list. Go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to take advantage of our wholesale pricing, including my classic standard MyPillows, only $14.88. But that's not all. I'm so confident you're going to love our classic MyPillows that I'm going to extend my 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st, 2025. Plus, orders over $75 ship absolutely free.
Folks, we're back with Colonel Doug Macgregor. He's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. He's got a new piece out for American Thinker, and I recommend it to you guys to go read it. It's short, great read. Iran, America's next war of choice. The U.S. is at risk of being buffaloed into a bloody war of regional realignment in the wake of Syria's collapse. And you can go ahead and read that over at American Conservative. Colonel Macgregor, great piece. There's so much going on in this world. Another war now in Syria. What is Israel's play here as it relates to now moving into Syria, as if they don't have enough wars going on in Lebanon or in the Gaza Strip, or, you pointed out.
People will remember 7 October. And when I first saw the film footage, including some of the footage that not everyone has seen, I was horrified. And, I thought that the Israelis had every right in the world to respond to it. But I hoped at the time that they would respond in some way other than collective punishment. When you engage in collective punishment, you nearly always fail. I've seen that in the Army. I've seen it everywhere. You seek to punish 800 people for what one or two did, it fails miserably. But then as I looked at it, more and more and more information came into me. I've begun to think that what happened on 7 October was allowed to happen, because everyone knew about it. When I say everyone, you had people in the Israeli system of intelligence, especially a group of women who were tasked with the responsibility to monitor everything that happened in Gaza. They were IDF members. And the Israelis, by the way, are very smart. They bring people in and then they say, okay, you have an IQ of 160, you go over there. And because you're really smart, we want you to focus on just these things. We don't do that. We tend to hammer lots of round pegs into square holes. It's stupid, but we do it. They don't. And these women did a brilliant job, and they anticipated what was coming, and they reported it. And they were told, you're wrong. Then the day before this attack unfolded, you had the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence in Egypt contact the head of intelligence in Israel directly and say, we see a horrible attack building in Gaza directed at you. Now, I've been down to Gaza. I've seen the Israeli security measures, and I visited their headquarters. The Israelis are very competent people. Not much happened over there that they would not know about. It would have taken almost no effort at all to say, well, just as a precautionary measure, let's bring down a reaction force of tanks and Merkava tanks. How many tanks do you want? 15, 20? And then we want to put attack helicopters on standby, and we'll put a couple of jets on strip alert. If they'd done that, as soon as something broke in Gaza, it would have been destroyed. It wouldn't have made it 150 meters. That didn't happen.
Right.
I couldn't believe it.
Right.
I was shocked because I'd been there. I'd seen them. I know they knew what was going on.
Plus, Israel's got to be the most secure country on this planet, Colonel.
Yeah, I think so. I've always been a great admirer of the Israeli wall,
right?
Simply because we should be building something like that across our Mexican border. And there are places in the north that we could use that sort of thing. But my point is, I really think they knew it was coming. Netanyahu may be responsible for this. And he decided that this would be his opportunity to leverage this event to justify mass ethnic cleansing of Arabs in Gaza and ultimately the West Bank. But as he said several weeks afterwards, we are going to settle accounts with everyone. We have a front down in Gaza. We have a front in southern Lebanon. We have a front on the West Bank. We've got a front with the Houthis. We've got a front against people in Syria. We have another front against Iran. We're going to settle it all. When we're through, it'll all be gone. And right now, he's boasting that he's changed the face of the Middle East. Well, I think he has. But nothing ever stays the same. And when you throw a grenade into a mess like that, you're going to have a lot of blowback. And the blowback hasn't even really begun yet for Israel. And we're the ones that are being asked to protect us from the blowback. So I think the next step for him is attack Iran while he can. And I don't think he's going to wait for Donald Trump to be inaugurated, because many of his advisors and his inner circle may say, well, if we wait, are we certain that Donald Trump will go along with what we want to do to Iran? Or will he raise questions? Will he try to constrain us? You know, I met with Donald Trump. I know his intentions are true and good. He may not always understand everything, but this is not someone who argues for war.
Right.
Now, what would he really do? So I think they would much prefer to present him with a fait accompli. Let's get the war with Iran started, because they know once that begins, it's not going to end quickly. It's not going to be over in a couple of days. Now, that presupposes that he does not, that is, Netanyahu does not authorize a first strike with nuclear weapons.
Right.
That could happen, in which case it's still not going to end quickly, but it could spread very rapidly and become extremely damaging to everyone. But that aside, I think they would like to have this underway and put President Trump in the position of, well, you have to support us now. Because as soon as they come under serious attack, they'll scream bloody murder for us.
And we'll be in another war, another endless war over in the Middle East that has absolutely nothing to do with us. Going back to, we had heard reports that I believe it was Egypt had told Israel about that planned October 7th attack. Lou, and I don't know. We don't know. We take in all the information and then we make a decision or an opinion based on it. Lou always used to tell me, if something doesn't seem right, lift up the rug and there's probably a mouse under the rug. And it just makes you wonder, the most policed country in the world, the most policed territory in the world, the most secure territory in the world, the best probably intelligence in the world would allow something like this to happen. But it wouldn't be the first time in history we've seen. We saw 9/11, about the intel that we knew that came in from 9/11. A friend of mine, Tony Schaefer, had tried to alert the government that about one of the bombers on 9/11. We find out later, and at the end of the day, Colonel, it all gets brushed under the rug. It's a conspiracy. It never happened. It may have happened, but it wasn't good intel. I'm sorry, but if someone gives you decent intel that someone's going to blow up your country, if someone's going to do a mass killing on your homeland, you better take it and heed the warning, at least somewhat. So you say Netanyahu's top priority is the destruction of Iran before Russia wraps up its victory in Ukraine. We've only got about a month before Donald Trump comes in. Is he able to do that? I mean, he goes into Gaza, which I told you before the show. I equate him invading Gaza, if Rhode Island wasn't a state and the United States were to invade Rhode Island, it would be gone in an hour. Now we look at this thing going on over a year, still Gaza's still there, everything's still flowing. What is taking him so long? The parallels between this Zelensky thing in Ukraine and Netanyahu in Gaza and Lebanon seem far too similar, in my opinion.
Well, first of all, I think we need to set aside Zelensky. He's always been a puppet for Washington. He's going to bloviate until it becomes clear that he is either going to be killed if he stays or had better flee and, as you say, leave with stacks of cash. Although I'm sure he's already moved a lot of his wealth into banks in the United States as well as Cyprus and other places. So he's dead. It's over with. I'll be surprised if he survives. Now, secondly, when it comes to Israel, it's a different story. Go back and look at President Netanyahu's speech in front of, I think it was the UN, where he held up a map and he pointed to the map. And look at that. Look at the borders on that map. The borders are very different from Israel's borders. You no longer saw anything on there really about Jordan.
Right.
Syria was largely ignored. Half of it was now part of Israel. Southern Lebanon was part of Israel. And even the Sinai and part of Egypt was part of Israel. So I think that's the game plan. And he's determined to make it work. And his view is we are the key to success. As long as we are obedient to his demands, he can do anything he wants. And I think the evidence to this point demonstrates that he's correct. Now, is President Trump willing to cede his presidency to Mr. Netanyahu? Biden effectively did that.
Yeah.
I mean, go back and listen to early Biden before dementia, then listen to Biden after dementia. They're two different people. I mean, this is a man who talked about very different things in the Middle East, very different things in Ukraine and Russia. I think he's not in control and hasn't been for a long time, which is why I called for his removal, at least a year ago, if not earlier.
Right.
It's tragic it hasn't happened. We don't know who's been calling the shots. I hear a lot of strange rumors on that, but I think we know he isn't. Is President Trump willing to let others call the shots for him on behalf of Netanyahu? Or will he become president of the United States? Will we have an American first administration? And everybody acts like, well, that's terrible. That's isolation. No, it isn't. Isolation means that you seal yourself off from the rest of the world. Most of us who have advocated for an America first policy have said is we don't want to use military power all over the world.
Right.
That should not be our first choice. We should opt for diplomacy. We should opt for economic assistance. We got to get out of this business of sanctioning and bullying people. All we do is bully, bribe, or bomb.
Right.
It's got to go away.
Right. Just tell that to the senators. You know, you bring up a very interesting point about Netanyahu wanting to push his borders further. And I think it does bring in some sort of conflict if he thinks Trump is going to help him with it. And it's simply because of the Abraham Accords. How does Netanyahu get past that when President Trump is the one who was attempted to broker peace? How does he convince Trump to say, you know, you can push into the borders of Jordan, you can push into the borders of Egypt, you can push into the borders of Lebanon, you can push the borders wherever you want, when 4 years ago, President Trump was the only reason, I say this on every show I talk about foreign policy, President Trump is the only reason Israel is standing right now because of those Abraham Accords. If those Abraham Accords aren't in place, I think Israel's probably wiped off the face of the map after October 7th. That's my opinion on that. But how does Netanyahu go to President Trump and say, well, now I want to expand my borders here after President Trump just 4 years ago brokered peace in the Middle East for this to not happen?
Well, this is where we go back to the original point about arson. The fires are set. They're raging out of control. How do you stop the fires from burning all the way across the region and affecting virtually everybody? These Islamists that are killing large numbers of people, many of whom are Christians, beheadings, the usual thing. We see these videos that are quote unquote unauthorized of people being mass murdered inside Syria. Then we see another video that's obviously staged where the Islamist jihadist stands there and says, oh, we love Israel.
Right. Of course.
Right. Good luck with that. I think the Israelis are smarter than that. But the point is that everything's being burned down. When everything's burning down, what do you do about it? You try to put the fire out, but frequently, if you don't put it out quickly, what does it do? It spreads. Well, it's already spreading. That's why the Turkish army is building up on the border with the Kurdish state inside Syria. The Turks are going to crush the Kurds, absolutely, without question. They've been up to this for a long time. People now don't remember when we went into Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq in 1990-91. The Turks asked us, please don't dismember Saddam Hussein's state. If you dismember this state, we'll end up with a hostile state on our border called Kurdistan.
Right.
Well, we effectively did it anyway.
Yeah.
And 2003 begged us not to go in and, of course, told us, we're not helping you destroy Iraq.
Right.
Go somewhere else. You're not going through Turkey. We all forget these things.
Right.
I'm not saying that I support the Turks. What I'm trying to point to, and this is something we don't get, nations have interests. We tend to ignore those because, as far as we're concerned, everything everywhere is of interest to us.
Right.
When in fact it isn't.
Right.
But they have interests. We don't respect them. The Turks are now going to fix this problem. Now, once this problem is underway, it's going to take some time. You don't smash something like the Kurdish state inside Syria overnight. I don't know how long it'll take. The Israelis, in the meantime, are holding on to the bottom southern portion of it. But let me point to something else that nobody in the West has talked about. It's very important. I wouldn't have noticed it except good friends from the region pointed it out to me. The Turkish intelligence chief just a few days ago flew to Damascus for meetings with the jihadists. As soon as he landed, he got off. He had a Turkish military and secret police escort. They took him to the Umayyad Mosque. The Umayyad Mosque was built by the same group of sultans or Turks and Arabs that built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. It's about the same age. It goes back to the 9th and 10th centuries, roughly from 850 to 940. This is a very important mosque because the Umayyad dynasty, which was the second caliphate after Muhammad, is, maybe they call it the first, I don't know, but it was a caliphate. It's associated with Muhammad's successors. He went there and he prayed in the Umayyad Mosque. Nobody paid attention to it. That's what he did. The first thing he did in Damascus. Now, that was a signal to everybody in the region of what? The empire is back. The empire being the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
That's what he was there for. He prayed there. We have returned because they never, ever, ever, ever in Turkey accepted the outcome of the First World War. Kemal Ataturk did that because he knew the Turks were too weak to do anything about it. He wanted an end to all that fighting so he could build the state up. Well, Turkey is no longer weak. It is a major regional power. And they are now feeling their oats in a rather dramatic way. So that visit was very symbolic and very important. I'm sure the Israelis figured it out.
Yeah.
Maybe they didn't. Maybe they've reached the point where they are so arrogant that they dismiss this. But that's a symbolic move. Anyone who doesn't think so is deranged. This was a big signal to the whole Islamic world.
Oh my God. We're in a big trouble. I mean, you'd mentioned the interests of people and why we're in these wars. And the only interest I could think of, Colonel, is the military industrial complex and these folks making money. President Trump, you often heard him say when he was first in office, we invade all these places. We didn't even take the oil. You mentioned every country has their interests. We go into these countries, we overthrow these governments, we get nothing for it, and I don't think we should get anything for it. We're hated around the world, as you mentioned. I completely agree with you on that. And rightfully so. We go into these nations, we tear them apart, but we get absolutely nothing out of it. We leave oil behind. We leave equipment behind. We leave military equipment behind to terrorists, and it seems to be completely fine. Mm-hmm. I know you're strapped on time, and I really appreciate you joining us here today, Colonel. Before we wrap up, I promised we were going to talk about the war we have here at home, one that we should be fighting with terrorists here on our southern border, terrorists here in our country, the drug cartels, the drug lords, the drug manufacturers over in Mexico, the Chinese that come through that southern border. What are we going to do? I mean, do you think in this administration, President Trump will treat these folks like the terrorists they are and extinguish them the way they should be? We heard in the first administration, according to some folks, that he maybe wanted to blow up some of those drug factories. I thought it was the most brilliant thing he could have possibly done. We've launched missiles in countries, as we spoke about all today, that have gotten us nothing, and they're for absolutely no reason. This is for a reason. Do you think we see him treat these folks like the terrorists they are?
Well, I hope so. But I think the first thing that the president has to do is make it clear to the American people that Mexico is an organized crime state.
Absolutely.
Let's stop pretending that the president of Mexico controls or exerts influence over more of the country than perhaps 40 square miles in downtown Mexico City.
Yep.
Whatever he says, whatever he does, it has to be cleared with the drug lords. The drug cartels control everything. That includes most of the army and the armed forces. By the way, they're very well armed. They've got a lot of equipment, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance.
From where, though? Where did they get it from?
Drones. We're worried about the drones we're seeing. Well, strap yourselves in. They've got plenty of unmanned aerial vehicles down in Mexico, some of which are armed. You can watch carefully and you'll see our Javelin missiles that were purchased probably from the Ukrainian mafia or mafiosos have been sold and are now in use down in Mexico.
Wow.
We've got real problems there. The second thing is there is no alternative to military control of that border. It's not because the Border Patrol isn't any good. That's wrong. These people, I mean, they've had a high suicide rate because so many people in the Border Patrol are absolutely beside themselves at what has happened. J.J. Carroll has written a book about treason, and he talks about the treasonous behavior of the last administration. We're talking about the current one, actually. I shouldn't say last.
Right.
And its treatment of things on the border. And J.J. Carroll is somebody you should bring on. He was with the Border Patrol for over 20 years. He'll tell you the same thing. The problem for us now is that these millions of illegals, in many cases, are here because they went through the organized crime state to get here.
Right.
That means that they had to pay a certain price. Now, we know almost all the women between 12 and 60 are raped. But beyond that, we also know that a lot of these people are told, once you get over there and we come to you and we tell you to do something, you better damn well do it. The drug mafias are present now inside our country in all the major cities and in many places in the countryside. They're also in control of so much information that it's frightening. Nothing happens in that useless Department of Homeland Security that they don't know about.
Right.
So that's the war we have to fight. It's the war we have to win, or we will look like Central America in the future. In every sense of the word, every sense of that word. That means you go to Mexico, not just Mexico, Brazil, many other countries, and you'll see people with any degree of wealth at all. They build a house, they build a wall around it.
Right.
If they can't afford electronic surveillance, they put jagged glass or barbed wire on top of the wall. They pay people to guard them, not let anybody in or go out unless they're told, and so forth. I don't want to live in that society, but that's where we're headed unless we get control of it. And frankly, this is the last thing I want to get across. There is nothing more important than what happens in this country.
Right.
Whatever goes on overseas, anywhere else, shrinks to insignificance compared with what happens here. We've got to get through this terrible, terrible crisis here at home first. And just imagine all the things that we know are wrong. The financialization of our economy to the point where we don't produce anything.
Right.
This enormous sovereign debt, which everybody scoffs at and says, oh, it doesn't matter. Well, it's
we're going to find out one day.
Yeah. And our currency is being destroyed. Whatever else you want to go through. Right now, it's very strong, but in the long run, because of inflation and this money printing, it's in real trouble.
Yeah.
We need to take care of these things here at home now. We can't afford to have the Justice Department and judges all over the country releasing criminals onto the streets, rewarding criminals and punishing police. We can't do it. We can't maintain the state in our society. People don't seem to understand how important police forces are. And they don't understand that our troops sitting in Poland, Lithuania, Romania are just wasting time, money. They need to be home. We need to get them down on these borders, not just on the one to the south, but also up north. And then secondly, we got to get this nonsense, this old anachronistic 1945 structure has to change. The Coast Guard should not be independent of the Navy. It should be an arm of the Navy. And the Navy and the Coast Guard should both be involved in protecting our waters. And the Marine Corps needs to be protecting our ports and harbors, just as we should also protect our airports. All of these things have to be done. If we don't do them and we continue to focus overseas on other people's problems that are not our problems, you and I won't have much to discuss because we won't be around in 4 years.
You brought up an excellent point, and it's one that we haven't heard yet or seen yet. Our own military patrolling our own country. You know, you hear these politicians, Colonel, we'll wrap up with this, saying it's a bad look for our military to be here at home. It's a bad look for our military to have a presence here on our southern border, or it's bad optics. Well, what are the optics of sending someone else's son overseas that nobody voted for to fight a war that has nothing to do with us? What are the optics of that? What are the optics of protecting your kids from going to school and having a drug dealer sell them fentanyl they got from a Mexican or a Venezuelan drug lord? What are the optics of burying a 14-year-old kid who was overdosed on drugs? What are the optics of walking down 42nd Street in New York City and watching a man shoot up heroin on the side of the street as you walk by with your family? Does anybody think of those optics, Colonel?
No, they don't in Washington. They live in a bubble. What doesn't is what's not in their face doesn't matter. And their constituents, if they don't pay attention to their constituents, it's because donors ultimately outweigh the interests of constituents. We had all the Army's cavalry regiments on our borders from 1846 till 1948. All the so-called great men of the Second World War in the regular Army, generals, all served on the Mexican border. In the 1930s, the number one expectation was that we would be at war with Mexico at some point in the future. And that's where we were focused. It's hard for people to understand that right now, but they also forget that during World War I, Germans showed up in Mexico.
Right.
And after World War I, communists did. And the Soviet Union maintained its largest intelligence operation in the world outside of the Soviet Union in Mexico.
Right.
Right now, we have similar outposts in Mexico, and the international intrigue from intelligence organizations like Chinese and so forth, they are inextricably intertwined with the drug cartels. Now, the solution is not to start a war with China or Russia. The solution is close that border. And then you're going to have to fight a war inside our country, because if you think the drug cartels are going to take this lying down and lose all the income they get from this, you're wrong. We'll have to fight a war inside our country. And when that is underway, that's when you begin to look at where the sources are down south. But you do not, and listen to this, you do not want to invade Mexico and try to transform it into something it's not. You have to destroy the disease without killing the patient. You were talking earlier, everywhere we go, we end up killing the patient. We don't want to do that.
Yeah. When was the last time, this is something that Lou, and I promise this will be the last thing we touch on here. This is something Lou always asked. When was the last time the U.S. won a war, Colonel?
Well, I guess you'd have to say, if I stop and think about it, I think we won. We did not exploit it effectively, but I think we won in 1991.
Before that?
Grenada.
Okay. The point is, it's been a very long time. We should be fighting a war, and I'm very anti-war. I can't stand it. But this is an easy war for us to fight, Colonel. You said they're not going to take a laying down, but it'll be far easier, in my opinion, to fight these cartels than it is to ship everything overseas like we do and fight a war that's never going to end. I think this is a war that we can get done in less than 4 years. I think it's a war we can get done in less than 2 years. It's one that needs to be fought. I know far too many people who have overdosed on drugs and are dead now that I went to school with. Being in New York, it's a common thing for kids these days. I'm fortunate that I never picked up a drug in my life that, I've got to that point, but I do know people and I know families who have been ruined. So it hits me here hard at home, and it hits me hard when I walk down the street and watch people do this stuff.
Well, I agree with you, but just keep in mind, the donors who own the Senate and the House don't care about it.
Mm-hmm. I think President Trump is not one that's easily bought. So they're either going to have to get in line, Colonel, or they're going to have to get the hell out. And 2026 is going to be a test. We have 2 years now, from now to the Senate elections, where we're going to find out which one of these guys want to play ball and which one of these guys want to get their bills paid by these military industrial complex companies and these big donors. So we have 2 years, I think, to figure it out. And folks like Elon Musk is spending a lot of money to figure out who these guys are good and which ones are good and which are bad. Colonel Doug Macgregor is the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. You're a great American. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And I had a great conversation, in my opinion.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody, for being with us here today on The Great America Show. Please be sure to join us back here tomorrow for The Great America Show as our quest for truth, justice, and the American way continues. We'll see you back here tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, may God bless you, may God bless America, and may God bless the great Lou Dobbs.